Have you heard of Mast Cell Activation Syndrome or histamine intolerances? These overlooked conditions can lead to a lot of confusing and chronic symptoms. They can present a wide variety of different ways, including symptoms like unexplained fatigue, massive digestive upset. They can get anxiety issues, skin rashes, heart palpitations, dizziness, headaches, respiratory problems, and these are all related to each other. As seemingly unrelated as all of these things seem, they can all be circled back to mast cells and histamine. And so that is what I want to talk about today. These very overlooked conditions can be leading to a lot of people's chronic illnesses, especially the ones that don't respond to typical treatments. And that's because you don't have a typical illness. This is something that is very overlooked, but very treatable if you understand what's going on. So we're going to jump into what these conditions really are, how they can be triggered, how they can present, and things like that. But first, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Dr. Robin Lewis. I'm a naturopathic physician practicing in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and let's get into it. Okay, so in today's episode, we're going to go over how histamine and mast cell disorders could be the root cause to a lot of your chronically unexplained and misunderstood symptoms. And so this can be truly life-changing for a lot of people once they finally figure this out with their healthcare providers and get to treatments. But first, I need to explain to you guys how mast cells and histamine could be related to so many of these different symptoms. How does this develop? Mast cells are a type of immune cell found all throughout the body. You find it in the sinuses, your respiratory tract, your digestive tract, your reproductive organs, your heart. They are found all over the place, and their intention is to be a first-line defender against things like allergens, infections, and toxins. So when stimulated, they're going to release things like histamine and a cocktail of different substances to defend against those things. So initially with really good intentions. It's first important to note that it's not just histamine that mast cells release. Histamine is probably one of the more famous things that mast cells release, but they also release a lot of inflammatory compounds like prostaglandins, cytokines, and tryptases. And so these inflammatory compounds, yes, create inflammation, and they attract more immune cells into the area to defend against what you're trying to defend against. But the point is they can misfire. So sometimes they're getting triggered too easily, not by the things it should be triggered by, and it's causing too much inflammation, too much of a response. The body is in imbalance, and that's really where we start to run into issues here. So if we look at something like Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, aka MCAS, this is a hypersensitive mast cell. So it's releasing far too much to simple triggers. So things like heat, exercise, and food can start to trigger these things. Now, this is where you can really start to understand that this is becoming a chronic problem. And as I discussed before, the mast cells are found in nearly every single tissue inside the body. And so, of course, that means that things that you're doing on a daily basis could be triggering mast cells all throughout the body, leading to a wide variety of different symptoms. So depending on the person, for whatever reason, their mast cells might dump more in certain areas versus others, but the common underlying thread is the same. And your body can handle this to a degree, right? We're obviously primed and ready to release a lot of things like histamine and cytokines and prostaglandins. And if done appropriately, your body can clean up that inflammation, recover, and everything is good. But if it's being continually triggered inappropriately, you end up with a histamine overload and an inflammation overload. Now, this can happen multiple different ways along the line. So, yes, you can have mast cells that are way easy to trigger, and so they'll dump more frequently, and that's going to increase the burden, increase the amount of histamine and the amount of inflammation because your mast cells are dumping all the time. But you can also have too much histamine coming into the body. So this is where things like diet can come in. So a lot of histamine-rich foods, or you can have certain microbiome issues that dump a lot of histamine. And the point is, something is causing too much histamine to come into the body, and that's an external source that will also lead to an overload situation. And then the third way this can happen is your body's ability to clear the histamine, the prostaglandins, the inflammation isn't running very efficiently. So maybe you're not dumping an egregious amount of histamine, but your body's really bad at clearing it. So it builds up and it builds up and it builds up. All three of these things will lead to too much histamine and too much inflammation in the body. And that's really where we get into trouble, is when the body is overwhelmed and it can't keep up anymore. Things spill over, and now you're incredibly symptomatic and going through a flare period. And a lot of these people will go through good and bad periods, because depending on where the histamine load is that day or how triggered they were by external things like exercise and food, then they might have a worse day versus the other. And so this can be really why a lot of these people are very hard to track and very hard to diagnose, is because it might not look the same from day to day. Researchers also like to categorize MCAS disorders as primary, secondary, or idiopathic, which essentially means, is it genetic in nature? Are your mast cells genetically just malfunctioning because that's just the luck you had? Or genetically, do you not produce something like your DAO enzyme very well, which is part of the breakdown process? So that would be one reason, is genetically you're just vulnerable to this. Another could be secondary, meaning something is stimulating you, overstimulating you. So that could be allergy, toxins and infections, autoimmune conditions. There's too many triggers in the environment. So chronic infections are a very good example of this. Things like Lyme disease or chronic mold illness. Infections that kind of live inside you can perpetually stimulate your mast cells, among doing a lot of other damage inside the body. So that's another really common reason for developing this, is your body's just over triggered because it's dealing with something like a chronic infection, for example. And then idiopathic more or less just means they have no idea. So a lot of people, you're really just trying to figure out what their triggers are, because they can be quite a spectrum of different triggers, which we're going to get to shortly here. And I do want to cover histamine intolerances, but first let me just kind of again explain how many different systems can present with MCAS. So MCAS can look a lot of different ways. So say the mast cells in the respiratory system are not doing so great. That can mean getting things like wheezing, shortness of breath, sinusitis. You can develop respiratory issues that look like things like asthma. In the nervous system, it can present like anxiety, brain fog, insomnia, fatigue, dizziness, things like that, migraines. In your cardiovascular system, it can lead to a lot of overstimulation, so things like heart palpitations, spike to heart rate, fluctuations in your blood pressure, and you can develop things like POTS, which is posterior orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which is when people get really violent swings to their blood pressure when they go to sit up quickly and things like that. So these people tend to have a lot of vertigo and dizziness. And so that's kind of a link between the neurological system and the cardiovascular system. And a lot of these people have histamine intolerances or MCAS, because this is what's triggering all of the cardiovascular problems. In the skin, you can get a lot of flushing, hives, temperature changes. You can get a lot of digestive issues. So that could be things like bloating, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, often misdiagnosed as something like IBS or IBD or some sort of other digestive disorder, but they haven't fully ruled that out yet. A lot of these people have MCAS. And for the most part, there's also systemic symptoms. So yes, like I said, kind of fatigue. They tend to be very sensitive to a lot of things. So that could be chemicals and fragrances and cleaning agents, and it's setting off a lot of their symptoms. These people tend to be quite sensitive to the world around them. And in extreme cases, this is people who are anaphylactically reacting to everything. So they're getting really severe allergic reactions to a ton of things all of a sudden. I'm thinking MCAS for sure. But it's not just MCAS. So let's talk a little bit also about histamine intolerances. MCAS and histamine intolerances have a huge overlap. Histamine intolerances are generally, though, thought of as more of a histamine buildup issue. So this often has to do with poor elimination of things like histamine, again, having to do with things like your DAO enzyme, which breaks that histamine down. If that doesn't work well, levels build up. And so these people tend to present very similarly to MCAS. They'll get a lot of flushing and hives and digestive issues, maybe some dizziness and heart palpitations, often related to eating and things like that. They present very similarly. The therapies used to treat these things are very similar. And just as a side note, I am going to do an entirely different episode on the treatments because there's lots of rules of thumb, there's lots of options to circle through. So it's a broader topic that I want to spend a little bit more time on. So today I'm just going to go over the basics and some of how to diagnose it if you can. But a lot of these things are diagnosed based on symptoms because, as you can see, there's some reoccurring themes with different systems that can get affected, but all of them can come back to too much histamine, whether that be to oversensitive mast cells, poor clearance of histamine, buildup of histamine, or the related inflammatory mediators that are also released by those mast cells. Now, before we get into some of the triggers, some of the things that set your mast cells off and create a lot of these problems, I want to just briefly highlight the gut microbiome because this is a common and sneaky source of a lot of histamine. So we have over 100 different bacterial species inside our gut that have been identified to relate to higher than normal levels of histamine. So this can be common bacteria like lactobacillus, Bacteroides, Fusarium bacteria, Bifidobacterium, Clostridium. So even things like our very common lactobacillus that are found in a ton of different supplements can produce more histamine. So in these particular people, they might not tolerate those types of probiotics very well. They've also shown that people who have histamine issues, so things like histamine intolerances, tend to have a lower diversity within the microbiome. Generally speaking, a lot of illnesses are related to poor diversity and too many of the inflammatory bacteria, which again in histamine intolerance is also a reoccurring theme. So just an imbalance of the gut microbiome. And lastly, what they've also found in these studies is that people with these histamine intolerances also tend to have high zonulin levels, which zonulin has to do with leaky gut. It's a marker, a reliable marker you can look at that will show that the integrity of the gut is poor. It's not structurally as sound, aka it's leaky, which is where that term comes from. So this becomes a vicious cycle. The gut is inflamed because it's dealing with a lot of structural damage and a lot of inflammation from too much histamine and too many of these pro-inflammatory microbiome issues. That's going to further dampen your ability to respond and clear that histamine, and it can become a vicious circle. So microbiome issues are very common here, and that's a very well-researched aspect of histamine intolerances that I just wanted to highlight. Now let's get into some of the triggers. So bear with me on this section because I'm gonna have to read some of them. There are so many different triggers for people in this category of illnesses. So if we think about skin triggers, a lot of that has to do with temperature changes. So a quick shift to hot or a quick shift to cold, for example. Sometimes their skin's sensitive enough that even pressure changes or scratches that leave a big red mark, those can be signs of histamine being way too easily triggered in the skin. So those mast cells are part of the problem. You can also see histamine issues or mast cell issues being triggered by emotional states. So extreme emotion, high stress, poor sleep, things like that. Again, if you're living in a place where you're exposed to a ton of allergens like mold, dust mites, and things like that, those can be obvious triggers. We can also see a lot of medication triggering these people. So just to read them off quick, you can have common things like NSAIDs, opioids, contrast dyes, anesthetic, and even a lot of common supplements can trigger these people. They do tend to be quite sensitive to certain chemicals or scents in their environment. We can also see a lot of foods triggering these people, and that's where a histamine diet can come in. So a lot of high histamine foods are like the fermented foods. The longer bacteria sits on the surface of food, the more it can produce bacteria. So the fermentation process itself can produce more histamine on those foods, which is why a lot of people won't tolerate their fermented foods that they're being told are really good for them very well. And that's because their issue has to do with a histamine intolerance that's being triggered by the high histamine foods, for example. You're already putting on top of what's already an overwhelmed histamine overload sort of situation. You can often see things like alcohol, cured meats. Honestly, if you want to look more into the food, there are programs or resources online that go over histamine foods in general. And for a lot of these people, if you remove those histamine foods, it can reduce the burden at least to some extent. They also tend to be pretty reactive to a lot of food additives, not necessarily because the food additive itself is high in histamine, but it might trigger more release of histamine. So that could be things like benzoates, nitrates. You can see a lot of these food preservatives and food dyes really aggravating mast cells, for example. It's also really important to note that there is a common genetic variant that I did a whole episode on that relates to a lot of people who have these intolerances or these mast cell sensitivities, and that is genetic variations in our MTHFR gene, which is our methylating gene. There's not just that one gene, but overall, methylation is another process that helps you detoxify and clear things like histamine and inflammatory compounds that can get dumped by these cells. So this genetic variation, which can be corrected with good supplementing if you know it exists, is also very related to histamine intolerances. And a lot of these people have higher than normal rates of these genetic variations, which makes sense. They're not good clearers of histamine. So if you want to learn more about that topic, I did 2 whole episodes on the methylation pathways and the genetic variants and the treatments, and they relate a lot to this population of people, which is super interesting. Now, you might be wondering where the switch happens for a lot of people, because for many people, they tolerated all these triggers previously. They could exercise without getting triggered. They could eat food like a normal person. They could bump someone and not have a skin rash appear because of it. So somewhere along the lines, things go wrong. And so there is a group of researchers who have tried to figure out why this is the case. And they've described it under an umbrella term called TILT, which is toxicant-induced loss of tolerance. It's essentially a process where you've been exposed to so many chemicals, so many pesticides, so many antibiotics, so many different things in your environment that your immune cells are now primed and sensitive for those things. So you've lost your tolerance. You've been overstimulated and overworked for so long. So now the tolerance is much lower. What you previously could handle without it being triggering is no longer there. Your threshold is lower. So it takes less chemical in your environment, less mold in your environment, less burden on the system to create a trigger of your mast cells that dumps a lot of the histamine and immune-related compounds. So this is a very important thing to understand, and that's why I wanted to bring it up, because this is another area you can start to look is under this TILT category, because a lot of people fall under that category. One study that did a survey of a bunch of different people in the US found that approximately 20% of these people would call themselves chemically intolerant. And all of those people associated with increased exposure to things like pesticides, mold, even things like breast implant syndrome, the slow leakage of toxins that overwhelm the system and eventually lead to an intolerance where now you're triggered by everything. So this is a big part of the problem. And this leads to the last topic that I'll talk about today, which is how to test for these things. So first thing you need to know is that most people will not get a diagnostic test. It's extremely hard to test for these things because say you're trying to measure an increased amount of these things that are released, well, they come and go really quick. So if you're trying to measure something like tryptase, which I'm going to talk about shortly, which is technically diagnostic of something like MCAS. If you have really high tryptase levels, great, you have MCAS. The problem is trying to capture that at the right time is extremely hard. And so a lot of these people will be diagnosed without these tests. You can make a lot of sense of it when you get into treatment. Do you respond to the treatments? Do the cluster of symptoms make sense in the context of MCAS and histamine? Most treatment is being done that way, but I will discuss some of the labs just in case you can get a hold of these things. And if you do, they are very diagnostic and very specific to this cluster of issues. Okay, so I'm just going to go over some of the testing that is out there, but again, very hard to obtain. So we have things like chilled serum tryptase, so chilled blood measurements of things, aka very hard to get. So chilled serum tryptase and chromogranin A, so very specific molecule there. Chilled plasma prostaglandin 2, histamine or heparin. So these again are different compounds released by the mast cells. They don't just do histamine here. You can also see things like chilled random and 24-hour urine studies that will look at PGF2 alpha and methylhistamine. And there's a couple diagnostic criteria that you'll see. So one common one used is something like molderings. So they have a major and a minor criteria. So if you want to look up some of these things online, the moldering diagnostic criteria is a common one used. But again, just know that a lot of people are gonna have to begin treatment without formal testing because the formal testing is very hard to obtain. Not a lot of clinics do it. There's a lot of steps involved. It's incredibly hard to actually find a window of which you're flaring and well enough to go to the lab and get this very specific lab because again, a lot of these things will come and go very quickly. So that makes them very hard to test for. It doesn't necessarily mean you don't have MCAS or you don't have a histamine problem if you don't have these labs, because a lot of people will test negative, and that's just because it was tested at the wrong time or the wrong labs were being performed. So just something to think about. It's very complicated to diagnose formally using labs and urine studies. So you might have to jump into treatment and see how that goes, because that can be extremely eye-opening. Do things like antihistamines cause an improvement? Those are some of the steps that you see a lot of practitioners taking to really get clear on things because the testing is so challenging. So sometimes they'll just assume, start treatments, and then response to treatment is how you can kind of understand whether or not you have this issue. But again, I'm going to go over all of the treatments and things to consider when it comes to really healing from these sort of things in the next episode. So thank you again for listening. If you have any questions and certainly any experiences, please comment all of those below. And thank you again.